Okay, so we're moving on to the last major section in the build. We're gonna do all of our track and panels. So I've laid mine out on the table here. So I have all my track in order. So these are gonna be all my horizontal pieces, and then I have all my vertical pieces to the side here. And then I've laid out all of my lower panels. We're gonna start with our lower section first. So I've got those all ready to the side here. And then I also have all of my outlets, the last of my hardware, our Loctite, and then our turnkey here. So the first thing I'm gonna do is take out one of my outlets, and you're gonna have a few pieces in here. There's gonna be this little faceplate, which you can use or you cannot use, kind of up to you. We tend to not use them. And then you're also gonna have your actual outlet. So this one's 12 volt. You're gonna have 5 12 volt and 5 USBs. And this has this little kind of washer on the back side. So what you're gonna do is basically place this right through the panel, and then this little washer gets threaded onto the back side, which holds it in place. I try to keep mine pretty consistent. On the back edge here, there's a positive and a negative. So I try to keep those straight up and down. I always have my positive at the top and my negative at the bottom. It just helps when you're plugging in the wiring later on. So I'm gonna go through and do that for all my lower panels first, so it's done. And then we can move into the van and mount our first piece of track and first panel. Okay, so we're gonna put in our first panel here. I'm starting with the forward lower sections. This is gonna be panel TX6. And then you're also gonna need a little trim piece that goes over this little bump out. So that's gonna look like this. And it has a label on there, and it should be MDTHCD. But it's gonna be one of the smaller ones, and you can see it kind of slips right over the top of this D-ring here. So I'm just gonna leave that there for now. This outer flange here is gonna be captured by this main TX6 panel, so it's going to keep it in place and tied up against the body of the van. So the other portion I brought in with me is this piece of TX6 track. So all your track is going to correspond with the label on the A-frame, so they'll match up. And then some of the track too is going to be symmetrical, like from one side to the other, but some isn't. So make sure to line up your holes first to make sure you're going the right direction before you're placing any screws. So I just kind of hold mine up here so like you can see this one's not symmetrical. Those aren't lining up. So I'm going to flip it around. And then those are lining up there. So this is the direction I'm going to want my track to be. So before I put my track up, I'm going to grab my panel. And we have all of our outlets pre-installed there. So this is where that positive on the top, negative on the bottom comes in handy. So we're going to take our drops here that we previously attached, and these are going to allow us to just plug right into those outlets. So the red's going to be our positive, and these have a little clip in there, like a little spade connector, and you just pop it right in there. Make sure you hear a little click and it's on there well, because I don't know if you can see in there, but it's easy to slide in like over the actual connection as opposed to really getting good contact. So make sure you're actually clipping in there. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do that with my other side too. So now that I have all my wires connected, I'm going to go ahead and put this in place. You want to make sure as you're kind of positioning it, you tuck this wire away so it's not like trapped between your panel and the wall. You want it to kind of just fold back into that bay of the van. And you see how it just sits over that trim piece there. We have a factory floor in this van, so you might have to, this one kind of just peels up, so you might have to tuck the panel underneath that. The panels of the Transit come really tight to the factory like sheet metal floor. It's possible yours is just the sheet metal as is, but if you have any kind of floor in there, just know you might have to take it back a little bit or trim it a little bit. You can also trim your lower panels to match up with your floor, but you'd want to kind of do that beforehand, obviously. So once you have that in place, we can go ahead and place our track. So we should still have all those holes lining up, as you can see there. And then we have our M6 by 25 bolts. And these you're going to want to put a little bit of Loctite on before putting them in. So I've got my little tube of Loctite here. Just need a little bit on the end. This is just going to keep all of your bolts from rattling loose as you're driving along. And remember, we're not using any power tools for this section of the build. You don't want any of these bolts to seize or get stuck in there. So you just want to use your hands and then your T-handle hex here. if you start to feel any resistance, back your screw out. You don't want to be cross threading or anything like that. So I get one in a little bit of the way, and then I'll do one in the middle and one on the other end just to hold it in there. And then we're going to want to leave this a little bit loose still, because in order to put this mid panel in, you want a little bit of play to kind of move things around as we're going in. So I put my bolts in about halfway. We might need to loosen them or tighten them down later on down the line. So we're going to go ahead and put in all of our lower panels. This should be the only one with a trim piece, I believe, but if there's any other trim pieces we run into, I'll show you how to put those in. But then after we've got all of our mids, or our lowers in rather, we'll move on to our midsection. Okay, so we've got all of our lowers in, and we just fastened the M6 bolts just kind of half of the way on all of those to give us a little bit of room to play with. We also went through with just a little like 12-volt outlet. You can use like a phone charger or something like that to go around and check that all of our 12-volt connections are working. Before you do that, you want to turn on your breaker so that you have power coming through. And then all the USB outlets, which you can kind of see here, are going to have a little light. So you can see that little green light's on, and that shows you that power is coming to those. It's just nice to check all those before you've got all your panels in so you don't have to backtrack. So next, we're going to move to TX7, so this mid bay at the forward part of the van here. So we have one big panel labeled TX7 on the back, a piece of track labeled TX7, and then we're going to have a little trim piece here as well. That looks like this. That's going to cover up this section here. Just like that. So the bigger flanges on this trim piece are going to be captured by the panel, and then the smaller ones are going to be captured by the track. So that will kind of just sit in there. I'm going to bring my panel in here, and then you should just be able to kind of tuck it under that loose track that we left. Perfect. And then our TX7 L-track piece is directional again, so it's not symmetrical, so make sure you've got it going the right direction. Then we can pop that up here, line it up with our track holes, and then we're going to do the same thing, just tighten these down about halfway. Remember to put Loctite on all of them. And then we're going to go through and do the rest of our mids, and then we'll move on to our upper wall, and outer ceiling. So we're going to go into our upper wall and outer ceiling. These can kind of go in pairs. They're actually going to be numbered the same. So you're going to have a TX16 and then a TXC16, and then like so forth, like a TX17 and a TXC17. So we're going to go through putting in this forward one here, and then we're going to do the one behind that as well, because they're going to go in a little bit differently. So for TX16, you're not going to have a piece of track in this upper corner. You do have, though, this little like U-insert that's going to capture an M6 bolt through the front of the panel. So that's going to kind of pull this upper wall panel in, since there's no track to capture it on the upper edge. So you're going to have a little box of bolts in your kit that are going to be M6, but they're going to be a button head. Still the same T-handle hex key to put it in. So I'm going to grab one of those and get it all ready here. And then your panel, your TX16, is going to have a little hole in here. It's a little bit elongated, just allows for the tolerance or how you put your kit in, just allows a little bit of wiggle room depending on your specific build. So this is why we keep these loose, so you can kind of pop that in there. Ooh. So that should line up with that U-bolt there. So as soon as this M6 bolt's tightened down, you want to grab your TXC16 piece. It has a little notch out of the corner here, so that corner is going to sit right above that bolt that we just set. It's going to notch in with a trim piece later on. So it works best to just slide it under your ceiling track first, and then pop it up into that corner, and then it'll just support itself on the top of that panel. And once we get our other pieces in, we can tighten this all down and it'll be locked into place. So now that that's up, we're going to move on to TX17, and that'll go in just a little bit differently. Okay, so we're going to move back to our TX17 section. This is going to go in a little bit different than TX16, so this is going to have a piece of track that goes along this upper edge of the wire chase. This is going to be how all the rest of the van's going to go. So you're going to repeat this process for TX18 and so forth. So I've got my TX17 piece here, and I'm just going to tuck it into this track underneath. And that'll capture that, and then you'll have a piece of track labeled TX17. And all of your upper corner track is going to have one edge milled off. So the flanged edge is going to point down. So that's going to go there and line up with your holes. And then you can tighten that down a little bit, and then we're gonna put our TXC 17 right at the top here, just like we did with our upper piece here. Okay, so we've got all of our upper wall and outer ceilings installed, except for our TXC 18 and our TXC 20. Before we put those in, we want to do our rear trim because it has a flange on there that wants to go under those panels. That'll make a little more sense in a minute here. But basically you're going to have 3 pieces for your rear trim. You're going to have this kind of big bulky piece with the hole cut out of it. And then you're also going to have 2 legs that are going to look like this. So I just kind of pre-place them on each side here. The legs are going to taper towards the top, so the skinnier parts are going to be at the top. But we're going to start with this bigger piece. But basically, all we're going to do to keep this in place is tuck it under the weather stripping here. So there's 2 layers to the weather stripping. We're just doing the first kind of surface level, if that makes sense. You don't want to peel the weather stripping all the way off. That inner layer that's actually on the sheet metal of the van has like an adhesive in it, so you don't want to mess with that at all. So we're going to pop this up in place here. So I'm going to pop this up in place. It's got 2 notches for the track. It's going to be a pretty tight fit, so this big hole is for the door catches here. Since our track is lowered in the ceiling, it's going to kind of push it up. Once it's secured up in place, that's not going to happen, so don't worry too much about that. And then I just start from one edge and just kind of work my way over. As you get a section under the weather stripping, it'll get easier and kind of allow you to push this up into that corner. And then once we have that totally secured under that gasket, we can move on and add the legs. Okay, so now that we've got our upper piece in place, we're going to move on to the legs. Getting your first one in will actually help kind of push this into place. You might need someone to kind of push up on this while you're getting this one set. But we have the bottom kind of tucked to the side of our factory piece here. There's the possibility that you might not have quite as much of a gap as we did, so you might have to trim this down or trim the lower portion of your trim piece here. But ours seems to be just the right amount of space. So I've got it kind of wedged in there, and then we're going to do the same thing with taking it right under the weather stripping. Okay, so we've got our passenger side leg in here. We did want to note that we did have to cut away a little bit of our factory floor here so that this could sit flush on the floor of the van. So just keep in mind you might have to do that. This is cut pretty perfectly that it sits right against the metal and then flanges in with that top piece. So you can see on our driver's side here, if we kind of pop over, our factory trim piece here on this step comes right up to this D-pillar, and that's going to be in our way. So we're going to just do a couple little plunge cuts and cut out maybe a 1/4 inch of that to allow this trim piece to just slip into that groove. And then we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to run this all the way underneath the weather stripping up to the top to meet with the top U piece. Okay, so now that we've got this rear trim piece up, we can go ahead and install our outer ceiling in the aft. So we're going to take my TXC 18 and just slide it right up against my ceiling track, and then okay, and it's got a little notch out of the front here. You want that to be pretty far back. It's going to capture our little trim piece. So you want your little trim piece here, and it has a flange on the side. So there's 2 pretty similar looking ones for each side. So you're going to have this little flange a little bit farther up and facing the inside of the van. So this is basically going to tuck under this panel, and then these little smaller flanges are going to tuck under this track here, and then this eventually will tuck under our vertical track. And then this top piece is going to tuck into this cutout in our ceiling panel. It can be easier if you have someone with you kind of pushing this piece forward, because you can see we have a little bit of a gap here. We need this to come forward a little bit. But do your best. It might take some kind of figuring out before you get it to pop into place. Okay. Get the cord on that one. Perfect. Okay, Okay, so we've had a chance to hold up our ceiling panels and see where the connectors coming off the ceiling panels are. And we know that this is a good spot for these, so we don't have to pass them underneath our speed struts at all anymore. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach my Deutsch connectors. You're gonna have a bag labeled ELTC DTCH, and these are gonna be your Deutsch connectors. So they're gonna come looking like this. They already have the butt connectors pre-attached, so all you have to do is snip these wires, attach these, crimp them, heat shrink, and then we'll be good to go to just plug them into our ceiling panels. Okay, so we've moved to the front of the van. The first piece we want to do up here is our B-pillar trim piece. This is going to be the one that has the nice hole out of it for our fuse block here. So what we've gone ahead and done is, you see these black marks on the wall here. We basically held this piece up in about where it's going to be, so it's going to tuck into that track, up into that corner, and then you can kind of see where your fuse block wants to sit. So it's kind of a two-person job, but we kind of held this up, marked off where it's going to be, and then now we're going to want to acetone the space behind it, and then we can unstick those dual locks we put on there previously, and that'll adhere this to the van wall, and then we can move forward with actually installing this trim piece. Okay, so we ended up taking off our track piece here and then our TX16, both at the upper wall panel and the outer ceiling. Every van's gonna be a little different, so you might be able to keep those in place while you fit this B-pillar piece, but our fit was pretty tight. So we went ahead and took those down, and then by doing that we can put this B-pillar up first and then fit those pieces back on top, since this is meant to slide under them, if that makes sense. So now that we have those pieces down, we can slide this panel back a little bit and then back over top. And then now we'll be able to slide in this track piece here. Jackson's gonna help me out. And then you'll line that up with your holes, and this will put a little bit of pressure on this B-pillar and cause it to kind of push in the center here. And then we can reinstall our track bolts and then reinstall our TX16 pieces. Okay, so we've moved over to the other side, right above our slider door. We call this trim piece our slide liner. And it's gonna basically hook in under our headliner, just like our B-pillar piece did. And then it's gonna hook under our vertical piece of track on this side. So we're actually gonna set this vertical piece of track once we have this in place, just with a few bolts to keep this from falling down while we do the rest. So you can slide it under. Then it's going to sit up here, and then we're going to tuck it under the weather stripping, just like we did for the rear trim. I've got my TX3 vertical track piece, and I'm basically just going to lock in our first bolt here. Okay, so now that we have our B-pillar and our slide liner in, we're gonna move on to this biggest piece of trim. So this is gonna cover that kind of domed part of the roof right before the headliner. So this is probably the trickiest piece in your build. It kind of depends on your specific van and how your kit went in. So sometimes you can just slide it straight in. It's gonna rest on the flange of both these trim pieces on either side and then tuck right underneath the headliner here. Sometimes you kind of have to bring it in at an angle. You can see we've removed our ceiling tracks here, just to make it a little easier. Yeah, just kind of play around with it until you can get it to fit in there well. So we've got it close. You can see there's just a little gap along the front edge, so we're going to keep kind of fiddling with it and tapping until we can get it seated into place. So Jackson's just adding some sticky foam. You can use some of the foam that came in your kit or whatever you have on hand. We were just having trouble with the forward corners, like up against the headliner, not setting down into place. So this is just going to help push them off the van body and let that kind of settle into the grooves that are made into the trim piece.
Look.
We can reinstall our track pieces, and then we'll put up our last ceiling panels, the one on the passenger side here, and then reinstall TX16. Okay, so now that we have our track reinstalled in our ceiling and our outer ceilings installed, we're going to move on to our center ceiling. So we're going to start at the forward section here, and we're going to connect the Deutsch connector we added on to the one coming out of your ceiling panel here. Jackson's going to hold this up for me. Should hear a click, it'll snap into place. And then we kept these ceiling tracks pretty loose. There we go. So you're going to see it just kind of rest on the flange. And now we left out our cross pieces because it just makes it a little easier to get both the front and the back in. So we're going to move to the back, put that one in, and then we'll get them nice in position and reinstall those cross pieces of supports. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and install our back panel. This is the one with our ceiling fan hole cut out of it. So we're going to plug it in just like we did the front one. I'm going to have Jackson lift it up for me here. So we slid it forward. There's going to be there's 2 sets in this ceiling panel and then 1 set in your forward ceiling panel. They're pre-drilled holes. Those are just meant for your M6 bolts. Those are going to thread into those little like orange smaller supports that we added into our ceiling. And that'll just help, like you see how this is bowing down a little bit, help just like keep it tight up to the ceiling once everything is installed. Once you have all of your ceiling in and your tracks tightened down, you can move on to the last step of your ceiling, which is going to be the shroud around your fan. We just have 1 fan in this van, but you might have 2. So you should have set this aside at first when you unpacked your fan kit. It's going to be pre-cut to the right depth for you already. And then you're also going to grab the 4 little screws that was also in your fan kit from Max Air. And these have a white painted face that are going to help them blend into this shroud. So this is going to fit right up into the little gasket that's right around the edge of your fan. And you want to make sure it fits up there nice and snug. A lot of times it'll kind of hold itself up there for you. If not, you might need a second set of hands to just hold it there while you're screwing this into place. But basically, you're going to take these 4 little screws and just put them directly through the pre-drilled holes in the shroud and attach it to the panel. So before we put the rest of our vertical track in, we have a few trim pieces up front here. So the first one on the driver's side, just behind the B-pillar, is going to capture this wire that leads from our fuse block to our main power of the van. So this trim piece has a little lip in the inside here, and this cord is just going to tuck right in that. If that makes sense. And then down here, you can remove it if you need to. There's a D-ring down at the bottom here. And that's what this little notch at the bottom of the trim piece is just going to tuck right over. So once we have that cord tucked in and that seated, we can replace our piece of track, our TX5 here. And that's going to capture this panel as well as this piece of trim. So before we put the rest of our vertical track in, we have a few trim pieces up front here. So the first one on the driver's side, just behind the B-pillar, is going to capture this wire that leads from our fuse block to our main power of the van. So this trim piece has a little lip in the inside here, and this cord is just going to tuck right in that. If that makes sense. And then down here, you can remove it if you need to. There's a D-ring down at the bottom here. And that's what this little notch at the bottom of the trim piece is just going to tuck right over. So once we have that cord tucked in and that seated, we can replace our piece of track, our TX5 here. And that's going to capture this panel as well as this piece of trim. So we've moved over to the B-pillar on our passenger side. So this piece here obviously doesn't have any L-track or anything to capture it. So we're going to use a little bit of dual lock. So I've gone ahead and cleaned this whole area with a little bit of acetone as well as the back of my trim piece here. And that's going to allow the dual lock to stick nice and tightly to the skin of the van. So you don't need a ton. I usually just use like 3, 1 at the top, and then 1 at the bottom here. And then this is going to tuck right behind that D-ring, just like it did on the other side. And then under this piece of trim there as well. And then we're just gonna wanna tuck this under the weather stripping. Okay, and I just want to give it a nice firm press to make sure that dual lock adhered. Okay, so this last trim piece is going to go in similar to the one on the other side, and that it's going to tuck into the weather stripping and then under this D-ring here, but it's also going to tuck under this piece of track. So if you need to take that track out again to make everything fit nice, that's totally fine. But same idea. I got it under the weather stripping, which is going to help to hold this piece up. So I'm going to go ahead and take out the few bolts I have in this vertical track and then replace it on top so it sits nice and flush. Okay, so I've taken this piece off and just set it back in place. You can see it kind of stands off the wall a little bit here. This is going to be the case with all of your vertical track. You want to make sure not to pull the piece in with your actual bolts, but you want to use a little bit of body weight or someone working with you to push on the track into place and then thread your bolts. And you just want to do a few turns on each one and then kind of do them all a little bit at a time as opposed to cranking one all the way down and then moving to the next. This is just going to allow the track to kind of mold with the van a little better and not put any wear on the bolts. It's better too to start from the middle out since this is going to be your most bent point. So you're going to push in here, set this bolt, and then move up and then move down. So now that we've finished putting in all of our vertical track, we're going to move on to the last step in our wall panels, which is going to be the bottom edge of our lower panels. They're all going to have these little pre-drilled holes in there, and that's meant for either a set screw, which is what I'm going to use, or you can set a rib nut behind there and use a bolt as well. You'll have enough button head bolts in your kit to do that. So we're going to go and just put in our set screws for this van. So now that we've finished the main part of the van, we're going to move on to some trim pieces to finish things off. We're going to start with our back doors here. So we just have panels for the top sections in the transits. So you're going to have these two plastic pieces that are upholstered, and they're going to have some VHB on the back, which is like a double-sided, really sticky tape. So we're just going to peel off that tape and then put them right into place. You're going to have one for each side. And then you just want to press down really good once you have them up there to activate the adhesive. So we're going to add our faceplate to our B-pillar trim piece here. This is just going to hide this fuse block just so it's out of view. It's not the prettiest thing to look at. So you should have gotten this little rectangular piece here, and this just fits right over the top. And we're just going to add a set screw in each of the corners just to hold it in place. That would be easy to take off if you ever need to access that fuse block. So the last thing we have to do on this van is this slider door panel. We're only going to have the lower door panel on this part of the van. So I've already started it. I put a couple of my bolts in, but basically we set those rib nuts earlier on, and you're just going to have your button head bolts thread right into those. So I've got a couple left here. Just going to thread those in, and then we'll be done. So now that we've put in all of our little trim pieces, the base build is totally complete. So now you can move on to adding any accessories you have, like your bed or mule bags, galleys, things like that, and you can get on the road.